So moving along in my presentation on the TSCA refresher, we are coming to potentially the most interesting and the most important component of my talk, which is an overview of the chemical data reporting. Looking at the overall intent and the regulatory requirement, it's a reporting requirement that industry has to submit production and use information to EPA in a recurring cycle. This cycle is quite extended, unlike some of the other chemical reporting. This one is every 4 years. Which some may indicate that could be a challenge because a lot of institutional knowledge is lost between the cycles. The staff trained or familiar with this reporting transitions out, and then additional training is required. So hopefully this slide deck can help your organization with getting a refresher on the CDR. And then once the EPA received this information on a repeated basis from the industry, EPA keeps that information into an evergreen database. And that paints a picture to the agency in terms of the entire universe that applied to TSCA, of course, of chemicals that are present that could potentially be an issue of exposure to workers, consumers, and environment. And then, of course, and hopefully, that will inform the overall reform TSCA system, where the ultimate objective is to produce derive a safer inventory. As I mentioned before, the reporting requirements are quite extended. The last cycle was back in 2016. And if you remember the other slides, the TSCA was reformed also in 2016, but that previous reporting cycle was still under the previous former TSCA rules and regulations. So what's distinguishing this cycle, the 2020 cycle, and it would be this first one ever under the new TSCA. So this is rather exciting. The reporting requirement will begin on June 1st of this year and run through September of 30th, also of this year. And essentially it will cover the production and use data back from 2016, 17, 2018, and 2019. Interesting aspect of this reporting is that there's certain threshold below which reporting is not required. So essentially, EPA is really interested mostly in the high volume, high production or importation chemicals. And this is mostly for commercial purposes. Another interesting aspect of this requirement is that, unlike some of the other reporting requirements, is that it is to be on facility-specific basis rather than organizational basis, unless you are an importer. In that case, it is acceptable to report the importation quantities and chemical identities, for example, at the headquarters of the organization. There's also the question, okay, fine, well, which chemicals am I to report? Well, the law says that it applies to individual chemical constituents, but also to bulk compounds with specific CAS names and numbers. So one of those bulk compounds are known as the unknown of variable composition complex reaction products or of biological materials, more commonly referred to as UVCBs. So even though they may contain many chemicals, individual constituents within it, they have been assigned a CAS name and number so that EPA is interested in reporting of those UVCBs. There's also requirements, if you have a mixture, individual components need to be reported. Even if you have alloys, a solid, there's also potential for applicability to CDR and even solutions, so liquids. It applies to both to organic and inorganic compounds, and a little bit of nuanced aspects of it is the intermediaries might also need to be reported, reaction products, byproducts, and wastes. And what's specifically excluded from CDR, and actually in fact from the overall TSCA, is the pesticides, food and drug administration materials, for example, foods, drugs, medical cosmetics, simply due to the fact that they already are covered and regulated by other US laws. This is very important. There's a number of exemptions that are available within the chemical data reporting, which should be considered before producing the final CDR database, candidate for database. In general, the law says that polymers to be excluded in general, microorganisms, there's certain listing of natural gas that need not to be reported. There's also the non-isolated intermediates in enclosed continuous processes. That exclusion also applies to byproducts with no commercial use. If somehow they end up as fuel or are disposed of as waste. And also if they are feedstock for extracting another substance. Looking at additional filter mechanisms, you have impurities and incidental reaction products. And if in small quantities, some of the research and development substances are excluded as well. And then the second to last bullet talks about the exclusion for any chemicals that might be imported as part of an article of an inert, non-removable nature. And finally, there's the exclusion for naturally occurring substances. But they must not be processed, and they are subject solely to physical processing. And there is some exemptions and nuances that probably are not a good subject to dive too far into this sort of recap type presentations. There's also that very useful feature in terms of the partial exemptions. By the rule, processing and use information is not required for certain petroleum process streams and low interest substances. And there's certain CFR sections that they are listed in. And as with majority of rules and regulation, there's certain exemptions as noted. Right. So let's talk about the practical aspect of what one needs to do to prepare a CDR database. Well, I think the main starting point, or point of departure, is to gather the site information and the identity of the site. That's something fairly administrative nature. Then looking at the chemical inventories, one needs to identify its name and CAS number for each entry. And then this is something that you would need later on, is that you need to assess how much of that product or a special group of products was manufactured and or imported for each of the years dating back to 2016 and 19. And then there's the decision management point or decision point, is the sum of all that of all the chemicals greater than 25,000 pounds in any year. And if it is, then it is subject to reporting. If it's less than that, it's unlikely. There's some exceptions, but it's unlikely. And then with this 2020 reporting cycle for CDR, there's additional processing and use information that will be needed for the principal reporting year, which is 2019. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, some of the petroleum streams may be exempt from this additional requirement, which is a very nice, useful feature. It reduces unnecessary burden on your reporting requirements. Part of the CDR is also interesting, is that because there's potential to provide confidential business information, claim or identity, and its use if it's needed. And then a lot of folks ask, well, how deep I have to dig to get information, because facility records change over time, ownership changes, staff changes, some of the records transition from paper form to electronic, and not everything is scanned. It was archived, may even been destroyed invariably. So how much information are we responsible for? And I think there is that general standard known as the reasonable ascertainable standard. In other words, available and obtainable institutional data from y'all's departments, individuals. Even simpler said, if an EPA inspector can find it, chances are it should be considered as part of the available information to be searched. Looking further on some of the CDR preparation database steps for that reporting year 2019 in this cycle, processing data will need to be looked at. So type of process, the categories of products, and those are listed in the bullets, but I'm not going to spend too much time on those. And what's also interesting, not only you are to look at your own process, but also the downstream process information, which may require some type of coordination between the value chain members. In terms of the information needed for the types of uses, those are also listed. And there's some sensitive uses that EPA is highly interested in. Worker exposure, use in children's products, the extent of potential exposure, so number of commercial workers exposed, and so on. So there's a little bit of extra requirements, or extra data that need to be extracted as well. All right, so then how do you submit that information once you have gathered it? Well, EPA is requesting that all the information be captured of what is called the Form U. Unlike the old way of submitting those, Now everything is electronic. So data can be entered electronically into the Central Data Exchange, or CDX. It's an online system that EPA has. From the practical perspective, the data entry can be performed by multiple individuals who are cleared to get the access, be it internal or external consultancy, for example. But the final submittal, the final sign-off has to be by the company authorized official. So somebody who is qualified to submit documentation to US EPA. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what changes have been made to the CDR reporting now. I talked about how TSCA was reformed in 2016 and how the previous CDR report was still performed under the old system. But now the CDR has been amended, and there's a number of amendments have been made since 1986. And the latest, in fact, still not has been published in Federal Registered. I believe it's in its final form, and commenting period has been closed, but it just not have been published just yet at the time of production of this video. And some of the rule changes are listed in these bullets. There's some exemptions for small entities, exemption for byproducts, simplified reporting, and so on. I think that the overall intent of the latest amendment is to indeed reduce the regulatory burden, which is a positive development. Now, coming to the practical aspects of CDR reporting, I can never enough emphasize the importance of starting early. If you have maybe produced interim CDR reports on an annual basis, even though they're not required by law to be submitted, maybe your organization has kept track of those yearly, that's great. And if you have not, you have a little more work to do prior to June 1st. But by all means, do not wait to the last moment. Even though you do have some time in the reporting window to submit your reports, finding the reports in production volumes, identity, working out all the uncertainties in your data and QA/QC can take significant time. So definitely start early. The other complicating component of producing CDR is that it's really not up to any single individual department. Oftentimes, you do have to engage a multi-stakeholder team from regulatory compliance folks, production, procurement, marketing, engineering, and even research and development, as well as definitely legal department. So a lot of folks to visit with and get information from to be able to produce a good quality CDR database. And I can also I would like to indicate that quality assessment and quality control is also very important for a correct and accurate submittal of the CDR, and perhaps you can engage internal or external subject matter experts to make sure you're doing everything as the rule requires and is consistent with US EPA's interpretation.